So, creativity has featured in the top 10 key skills required for the workplace so many times. Yet, most people say and feel like they aren't creative. So, those two things aren't really adding up for me. And I want to know, what does that mean for the future of work? And what can we do to fix it or to prepare ourselves for this? Well, hello and welcome to Creativity Uncovered. My name is Abby Gatling, and I'm on a journey to uncover how everyday people find inspiration, get inventive, and open their imagination. Basically, I want to know how people find creative solutions for home, work, play, and everything in between. My goal for the podcast is that by the end of it, you'll be armed with a whole suite of tried and tested ways to summon creativity the next time that you need it. Now, today, I'm very excited to be speaking with Karen Kirton, who is absolutely passionate about developing creativity in our workplaces. So welcome, Karen. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I'm super excited to be here today.
Yes, I'm keen about this because, obviously I love creativity, and a lot of people say that they aren't creative. But when I hear things that, creativity regularly is appearing on these lists of desirable skills and needed skills in the workplace, I'm just like, okay, so something's got to give here. We need to either change people's opinion on whether they're creative or not, or maybe expand our definition of creativity, or just we need to do some type of shift to make these two things align. So let's start firstly with a little bit about you, because you work as an HR consultant. Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so my business is Amplify HR. So we're HR consultants. We generally work with small to medium-sized organisations. So as part of that, we're either they're outsourced internal HR because they don't have their own internal HR. But I also run a lot of leadership and team workshops, which obviously includes creativity, because we look at what are the skills that are going to be needed over the next 5-10 years. And we get clues from that from the World Economic Forum, because they release these wonderful reports every few years. So, and you're right, like creativity is always up there. And I rechecked this morning before talking to you, and it is at number 8 in terms of the emerging skills. And that it kind of makes sense, doesn't it, with the emerging AI that we've got now. AI is fantastic in so many ways, but it doesn't tap into that wonderful thing that is human creativity.
Oh, yes. Okay. There's a lot of talk about there for sure, regards to creativity and AI. But let's just take a step back and talk about this report that we're talking to. We're talking about the Future of Work report. Yes. What is that?
So what they do is every couple of years, it kind of got a bit of a hiccup there in COVID, but it should be every 3 years, that they go across the world. So it's the World Economic Forum that produce this, and ask CEOs of major companies and senior managers, what are the skills that your business is going to need over the next 5-year period. They ask other questions as well, but that's the relevant one for today's topic. So, and it also looks at what are the skills that aren't going to be in use as well over those next 5 years. And so the reason that I get quite excited about this report, and I go through it when it comes out, and particularly because it does break it down by region, so we can look at it for Australia and New Zealand as well specifically, which you can't always do sometimes in these global reports. But so when I get that, then I map, when we do leadership programs with our clients, I map the topics to those emerging skills, so that from the start, I can say to the participants, this is what we're learning. And actually, this is why, because if we don't start to think about these emerging skills, then you're going to make yourself redundant at some point. Now, whether that means your actual job is redundant, or it may just mean that you're doing work that is no longer valuable, which is also, nobody wants to do that. Everybody wants to feel like they have meaningful work. So it's trying to set that framework of we're doing this because there's actually a really good reason to do it. And the workplace is changing so quickly. I know that we hear that a lot, but it is true. And I've been in the workplace now for about 30 years, and it's just super, super speed now. So even though 2 years ago, we weren't talking about Chat GPT. Nobody knew what that was or what OpenAI was, whereas now it comes up in every barbecue conversation. So I think that's just a small example of how much things change. So that's where I try and take it from, is that holistic viewpoint of actually this is going to help you to be a more effective leader, and it's going to help you to actually retain the skills that you need, but also build upon what you're going to need over the next 5 years as well. And creativity obviously comes into that.
Yes. So, in this report, then, what do they define as creativity, and why is it something that they have flagged as being an emerging skill that's needed in the workplace?
Yeah, they talk about it in terms of creativity and innovation, and that might just make it more palatable for people in a workplace setting, I think. So there is no innovation without creativity. So that's the
Love that.
idea of it. Is that, and an example that I was told, I can't take credit for this, but the creativity, if you like, is I want to be able to see emails on my phone, and the innovation became BlackBerry. So that can be a way for people to start thinking about what that looks like in the workplace. So, and I think the reason why it keeps coming up is because although you're right, people often don't describe themselves as creative, we know that because of the pace of change at the moment in the workplace, and if we want to keep our businesses viable and growing, we have to innovate. If you don't innovate, then you're not going to have a business in 5 years' time. So then if you go back a few steps, well, if I'm not innovating, why aren't I innovating? Well, because we're not being creative. We're not thinking about things in a different way. And at its core, to be creative really just means that we're curious, and we're open-minded, and we're passionate. And I think people will describe themselves as those things, but they won't describe themselves as creative, because they start thinking about painters and artists and authors, and they're not really branching that out to actually creativity has a lot of different purposes and a lot of different descriptions of ways that we could be creative.
Yes. Yeah. And so you mentioned the AI earlier, and some of the skills that drop off the list that are no longer considered to be valuable skills in the workforce. Are those two things correlated?
Yes. So even prior to the likes of Chat GPT, I know there's lots of them now, but we like to use that one because it was really like that first mainstream one in terms of generative AI. But even prior to that, the statistics out of the report, and I don't have it in front of me, it was really high in terms of the amount of jobs that were going to be taken over by technological change. So because, when I was doing workshops on this, pre-COVID, which feels like 300 years ago, but it was probably, 8 years ago. So before Gen AI was really thought of in the mainstream, I was still doing these workshops talking about technological change and the pace of technological change and what that means. And we talk about the fourth industrial revolution, which is technology, and what that means for us. And a reflection point sometimes can be to think about social media. So 20 years ago, there wasn't social media. There weren't smartphones. It wasn't that long ago. We've now got a whole generation that's been brought up with that as the mainstream. But for a lot of people, huge amounts of their lifetime didn't exist with that. And so I think AI is another big change, like social media, that if you ignore it, it's at your own peril, because it really is changing the way that we do business. It's changing the way that we live our lives.
Yes. Yeah. That's interesting because quite a few people who come onto the podcast feel like AI is kind of the antithesis of creativity, and it challenges creativity in the fact that it replicates the creative works of other people, but we've got to somehow use it as well in the workplace.
Yeah, look, there's massive ethical considerations when it comes to AI, and I agree it's questionable in terms of copyright legislation and intellectual property and how it's being used. To use a really horrible old saying, the genie's out of the bottle, and we can't shove it back in. So I think the key now is to let the legislators and the regulators work out okay, what does that mean for creators? Because it's very important that creators, and I'm using that term in terms of authors, painters, visual artists, whomever, get credit for their work and get paid appropriately. So I absolutely never going to argue for that. However, we can also use AI to be creative because we can brainstorm with it. We can ask it questions to get a different perspective. I was talking to a client this morning who uses whole brain thinking. So it's a model that we use in a lot of our workshops. And I said to him, well, have you brainstormed with the robot on, I have this client proposal that I need to do, and that person has a really high blue thinking and a secondary yellow preference. How would I ask the questions? And, so you can do that. And to me, that is a form of creativity because you are innovating the way that you're interacting with your clients to get a new outcome. And so to me, that is creativity. It's just you are using Gen AI to do that.
I do think that there's definitely a definite skill set around the creative thinking that has to go behind trying to power some of these tools. But of course, creativity in the workforce is not just about AI, right?
No.
What does it actually look like?
So I think the first thing for me is that people need to decide on, well, do we value creativity? So, and we run a workshop, it's called Fostering Creativity in the Workplace. And I think that's the important part, is that we all agree that we want to foster this. Because when I do these workshops and I'll say, if you were all 5 years old, let's say there's 30 of you in the room and you were all 5, and I said, how many of you are creative? 30 of you are going to put up your hands and everybody will agree. And it's like, okay, so what happens when you get to 6 years old? What happens when you get to 15? What happens when you get to 30? And of course, the older you get, the less you consider yourself creative. And my own assumption, having been someone that didn't consider myself creative either, is that that's just our school system. So, we're set up to basically have the creativity kind of like drummed out of us. Like, no, you have to do this test, you have to sit in this box, you have to do these things. And sorry to get a bit of a soapbox, but I don't think as a society we necessarily value creators. So we value more things like science and maths. So I think there's a bit of a stigma in some ways for people to consider themselves as creative. But I think we also start to learn through schooling and socialization that creativity is just for those very small amount of people that are really cool at doing those arts and crafts things over there. So for me, it's breaking that down first and getting everyone to agree on, what, being creative is actually a good thing. And then what does that look like in the workplace? And so for me, it goes back to that innovation question, which is, okay, where does our business sit at the moment? And if we don't create new products and services, if we don't look for new markets, what does that mean for us in 5 years? So it's trying to really tie those two things together, that I personally value and believe that I want to be a creative person, and that secondly, I understand the value for my business as well.
Yes. Do you get a lot of pushback on people who are, attending these workshops that you're running, who have that very fixed mindset of like, I'm not creative? They're thinking about creativity perhaps in an artistic sense rather than an innovative sense. Do you get a lot of pushback about that?
Oh, absolutely. So, and that's where like really fun activities can come to play. So, so things like a simple one like manhole covers. So I get people to think about, why are they round? Like, why aren't they square? Why aren't they triangle? Like, that's a very practical innovation, if you like, that we had to create round manhole covers. Now, do you know the reason why?
No, please tell me. I never thought about it.
I'll get to test you on these things. And basically, it's because if it's round, then the actual cover can't fall through. Whereas if it was a square, you could set it on the diagonal and it could fall through the hole. So it was just one of those like simple innovations that was created to say, okay, this is how we need those covers done. So it's trying to get people to think about like something that's can be quite boring, a manhole cover, but it's very practical and it's around safety. But this is what drives our world. And you can then, pull out from people things in their own businesses that they can then recognize and go, oh, you know what, like that was actually a really cool thing that we did. And it was an innovation, which means that at some point someone created that, there was creativity at play.
Yeah, like it doesn't have to be an absolutely mind-blowing, groundbreaking idea for it to be a creative act, you know?
No, absolutely. And I think that's the key as well. And that's where I talk about, the qualities that go into creativity, which is that open-mindedness and, curious, and, we're passionate, we're resilient, and I get people actually rate themselves on, how much of that do they think that they have it. And that can just get people to start thinking and start to reframe in their mind. Yeah, you know what? Maybe I am a little bit creative. And because I know many years ago, my boss at the time, she always commented to me, oh, you're so creative, you're so creative. I was like, no, I'm not, no, I'm not. And it took a really long time for me to kind of embrace that and go, actually, no, I understand now what she's talking about, because I had that same feeling that, well, if I'm not an artist, I'm not a writer, then I'm not a singer. How can I be a creator? So,
Yes. Well, how did you get into that mindset? You mentioned sort of schooling kind of beating it out of us. Was that your experience growing up? Is that
yeah.
how you ended up in that mindset?
Yeah, I think so. And, I schooled in the olden days, so it was just probably even worse than it is today in terms of, this is your box, and stay in it. And the things that, we see socially that people value. And, we'll see that in every successive government that gets voted in. And the arts sector is always the first one to get their funding chopped because, well, that's not important. Why do we need that? So, whereas if they did that for healthcare or teaching, there'd be a different reaction to that. So I think there is a little bit of stigma around it, that people don't necessarily see it as something that they want to attach themselves to, versus, oh, I'm really, I was great at legal studies, or I was great at commerce. That's seen as like a good thing to be. And then the other part of it is really just understanding, well, if I'm not creative, then what does that mean? Because to me, if you're not creative, like I think everybody is, like you're not doing anything different. And of course, we all do different things every day, and we do things every week. We all learn something new, even when we're not realizing it.
I love the fact that you say that everyone is creative, because that's kind of such a hopeful thing to say. I believe the same too, but if we're talking about the future of work needing creativity and the fact that everyone is creative, then that means that everyone has this potential in them to be able to learn this kind of skill set.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, have you ever read Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic?
Oh no, well, has been recommended on this podcast. Good.
Need to read it. And it's a book that I recommend to people when they are particularly skeptical, back to your earlier question, because, and I do warn them, like it might feel like it's a bit of, out there. But, it's an amazing insight into how just creativity can be every day if you just look for it. Another one that I recommend to people, which is a bit more practical, is by Betty Edwards, and it's called Drawing with the Right Side of Your Brain. And particularly people that are quite left mode in their thinking, it can really help to start to, get into that right mode and go, okay, I can draw. Like it's actually, well, for me anyway, it was like just this mind explosion when I had that book to go, I can draw this amazing picture. And I think, that was one of the moments for me to go, no, like everyone is creative. We have it there. You've just got to get it out.
Yeah. Yeah. And you got to give yourself permission to just play with it, because it's not, you're obviously not going to be fantastic at the beginning. It is a skill that needs to be learned and honed and refined over time, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. But I think if we're not trying to learn new things, then the neuroscience tells us, our brain creates these ruts and grooves. So we're not trying to learn new things. We're going to continue to go down those same neural pathways all the time. And that's how you end up in more of that fixed mindset. So the more that we can learn new things, and the more we're going to be able to open our mind, become more growth mindset oriented, and therefore be open to things like embracing creativity.
Mm. So if the future of work, one of the skills is creativity that is with identified as being needed.
Mm.
And schooling is supposed to be preparing people for the workforce. Are we going to see a change in schooling to kind of
I'm,
change to
I'm not hopeful. Yeah, I'm not hopeful. I've not seen anything, and I've been, listening to futurists for a long time, particularly around university as well. Like, your degree is worth nothing by the time you finished your degree. And sorry, everyone that has degrees, and I know I have two of them, but it's a lot of effort and it's a lot of money. But the reality is, by the time you've finished learning what you've learned, it's all changed. Um, and back to the AI conversation, why do my kids need to know the date that Franz Ferdinand was shot? They don't need to know that. We all have this little device in our pockets that if we ever need to know that little factoid, it's going to tell us. So I think that we haven't changed the way that we have been teaching for a long time, and it is not suitable. It is just not set for purpose right now, because we don't need to rote learn anymore. Actually, what we need to learn is critical thinking, and we need to learn how to be more creative, and we need to learn how to see things from lots of different angles, and to not just believe that social media feed that's coming through, but actually go, you know what, I'm going to analyze that a bit. They're the skills that we actually need. We don't need to rote learn factoids.
Yeah. Yeah, that does seem funny to me, that this idea that you just have to memorize all this history or things
Yeah,
like
it's
that.
crazy. And I love history, but I don't see the value in my kids needing to learn that. Like, I think maths is an absolute fantastic skill because it gives you that logical thinking, the reasoning, the analytics behind it. So there's a lot, that maths has a value. And the same with English, because you learn to actually, critically think and look at things differently. But a lot of our other subjects that we do in school and when we go into university, you're just spitting out things that any robot can tell you. So it just
This is obviously a very interesting topic and something that you're passionate about. How did you connect creativity and HR? Because like that's an interesting connection for me.
yeah, okay. I'd love to know why it's an interesting connection for you. Can I ask you that first?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I think we have this sort of idea about certain professions. And part of this podcast is debunking that, right? We've had mathematicians on here, we've had financial planners, we've had these people who are, I'm air quoting now if you're listening to this audio, boring, sort of professions, right? And you think about something like HR, it's all about the legislation, it's all about process, it's all about this. I can see that some people would think that that might be one of those types of professions.
Yeah.
But then you've linked it so strongly to creativity. And that is really interesting to me. I'd like to know how you have come to that, how you've come to that point, because it probably wasn't, presented to you when you did your degree in this,
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. So, and I think HR, like any profession, there's lots of different ways that you can look at that. And there is HR that is the policy police at the Department of No. And, I have never, I feel, someone might write in and tell you differently, I have never subscribed to that type of HR. So, and I didn't start in HR. So when I finished school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. And I love people that know. I have never been that person. So I did lots of things. I did debt collection, I did sales, I did customer service. And then in the dark days when the internet just started, I became a web developer. And it was actually because I decided that I would follow that path that I thought, okay, now I'm going to go to university. So I didn't go to uni when I first finished school. And I started a Bachelor of Business and I was majoring in IT and marketing. And I was doing it part-time and working. And then I got an IT job. It was actually in Canada with Dell Computers, but I was in the sales team. So it was a lot of fun. And then I came back to Australia and I got some jobs through just like temping in IT departments. And I love IT people, but I'm not an IT person. That became very clear very quickly that actually I don't think this type of work environment is going to work for me. I talk too much, basically. So I just, that wasn't of interest. But the other thing is, because I was doing web design, I really enjoyed the process of designing. But when I had to do it for a job and someone else is telling you, well, no, we want this color, I want this thing. And I'm like, oh, you're kind of ruining my design. It actually took all the fun out of it for me. So I think that was like my first, I guess, understanding that actually when I'm creative, I just want to be creative. I don't want someone telling me, no, you're not allowed to have that kind of creativity. But then I got a job and it was working again with the sales department. But then that company hired their first ever HR manager and he said, hey, can you help me out with some stuff? So that was my first, I guess, look at, well, what does HR actually mean and what can it mean? So for me, it was looking behind that, the door and going, okay, actually, if you can look after your people and create a workplace that can engage and inspire people, you're going to have a better business. And if you can do that for everyone in your organization, they are going to be better spouses, better children, better partners, better neighbors, and suddenly you're actually creating this societal impact. So that's what got me into HR, was that feeling that I can actually do something at work that is going to impact people, not just at work, but actually just to be better humans. And so that's the HR that I've always subscribed to. So back then I changed my degree and I did HR and marketing instead. And then years later, I went on and did a postgrad in psychology because I've always been really interested in the brain and how it works. So I've brought, I guess, those principles together to say, okay, so if our brains work this way and this is what motivates people and this is what engages and inspires us, then how do we bring that into the workplace? And so I guess that's the connection for me between creativity and HR, is that actually we could still, and we do have lots of legislation in Australia, and we can still have to have that in the workplace and have to comply with those things. But just because you can do something doesn't mean that you should do something. So, I'm always talking to people about, like, that might be like the law. And yes, you've got to follow it, but actually you've got lots of choices around how you do that. So, and, use a very basic example, but at the moment, lots of people are sending people back into the office more days per week. So again, how do you do that? So do you actually come up with and really reflect on what your proper reasons are for wanting people to come back into the office? And then do you engage them in those conversations and really listen to them and then enable that to happen? Or do you just put out an email over Christmas as, guess what, from the 9th of January, you're back 3 days a week? So we all have those choices. And so to me, creativity does come into those choices because we have to take that moment to go, what are the options? And that's part of creativity.
Yes, that's so great. I think that's wonderful and a really great practical example of, how can you inject creativity into your everyday work, because it is all about choice. I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. It's just, for me, if you're nothing else but open-minded and curious, then you're going to have better outcomes.
So good, so good. And that's like a lovely little segue into a book. You've written a book.
I did write a book, so I am now a creator.
You've moved into the creator space yourself. It's called Great People, Great Business.
Yes.
And is that what you cover in this book?
The book is actually a very practical, so I'm actually a very practical person and I love things where I can take something and implement it. So I created it as a handbook for an owner of a business or a senior leader that's just like, I just need to work this stuff out and I don't have an internal HR person. So we go through, the methodology is called Find, Grow, Keep. So it goes through, how do you find the right people for your business? How do you grow them in your business? And how do you keep them? So I wrote that. Can't remember what it was now, but it was just going in and out of that whole COVID period that feels like such a black hole. But yeah, for me, I'm a morning person, so I was getting up at 4:30, 5 o'clock every morning, and I would just sit here with my cup of tea, and I would just write until I couldn't write anymore, and then that would be that day, and then I'd go back the next day, and so yeah. So after about 3 months, I finished the book, and I actually really missed the process at the end of it. Like when I first started, I thought, oh, this is going to be such a chore, but I actually really enjoyed it, and it was the publishing process that was actually the not fun bit, because back to what I was saying before, when you design something then someone else goes, well, hang on a second. So having the copy editors come through and have to do their things, which yes makes it better, but it was a long process back and forth having to do that and then finally get a product at the end.
Sounds like an absolute process.
You should do it, Abby.
Yeah, well,
I creativity.
I feel like there's something there. I don't quite know what it is yet, but we've had a few authors on the podcast, and they do say that having that little fire inside is the first part. So
yeah, I think you've got to have like, this is actually not just what you want to write, but who you're writing it for. I think was really important to me to say, actually, this is for me anyway. It was like, this is going to help people to make better businesses, and we know that small businesses, the statistics aren't great. So it's like, okay, how do we actually make people better and share more information and enable them to make better decisions than to just go with what's happened to them, which is often what small business owners do, is they think, well, that manager was horrible to me, so now I'm going to do that. Or that manager was horrible to me, so now I'm going to be super, super nice, which can cause just as many problems.
It is hard to not let your previous experience sully your future business.
Very hard.
But hopefully this book will help people with that.
Yes.
And what I'll do is I'll actually provide a link to this in the show notes. So if anyone's interested and that's piquing your interest and you want to get some practical tips on your HR, then you can find it there. Well, thank you, Karen, for joining me today and talking all about HR and creativity and the future of the workplace. So interesting.
Thank you. I really loved it. I was just so happy when I saw that you had a podcast around creativity, because I thought there's just not enough people speaking about this. So thank you for doing the podcast also.
My pleasure. It's an absolute blast getting to talk to people like yourself and just pick your brain. So that's so good. Well, I guess that's a wrap for today. I want to thank everyone who's tuned in to today's episode. I hope that you got a lot out of it. I certainly did. And if this has sparked anything in you and you want to take that next step with your creativity, let me know. I'm keen to hear what your next steps are. And if you liked it, please feel free to share it with a friend or drop us a review. Everything helps. Until next time, take care. If you've made it this far, a huge thank you for your support and tuning into today's episode. Creativity Uncovered has been lovingly recorded on the land of the Cubby Cubby people, and we pay our respect to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast has been produced by my amazing team here at Crisp Communications, and the music you just heard was composed by James Gatling. If you liked this episode, please do share it around and help us on our mission to unlock more creativity in this world. You can also hit subscribe so you don't miss out on any new episode releases.